Hello, everybody. Hope you enjoyed lunch, dinner, depending on where you are. We are thrilled to continue this great set of discussions. And we are moving on right now to session number 4. So we're going to be talking about adaptation to face natural disasters in cities. And for that, I would like to welcome our great group of speakers. So we will be having Ekhosuehi Iyahen, who's the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Fund. Sophie Evans, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Disaster Protection. Stuart Sarkozy, who's the Director of Global Strategic Partnerships and Development and Senior Advisor for North America for the Resilient Cities Network. Dominique Dussault, who's the Research Associate at the Goodwell Climate Research Center. And last but not least, Tadashi Matsumoto, who's the head of the Sustainable Urban Development Unit at the OECD. To moderate this great panel, we have our dear friend Coco Warner, who's the manager of Climate Impact, Vulnerability and Risks Subprogram at the UNFCCC, and also she's a visiting fellow at the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining. Coco, please, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you. Just a quick sound check. Is the sound okay, Mauricio?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. And thanks a lot, Mauricio, for the kind introductions of all of us. For the run of show, just to give everyone an orientation, we have about 90 minutes together in which we're going to really be looking at adaptation to climate change in an urban context. And we'll really be focusing in on extreme events. And we have, of course, Mauricio just introduced everybody, 5 world-leading experts to kind of walk us through what's going on, what are the good practices, how can some of this important work be financed, and where do we go from here? So to do that, we have structured our 90 minutes in the following way. Each one of our panelists will take 3, maybe 4 or 5 minutes just to make an introductory statement so that you as an audience can place them. And then we'll have 3 rounds of mini discussions. Round 1 is going to look at what the responsibilities of upper level government, what are those responsibilities for upper level government? Round 2 will look at cities identifying and prioritizing needs when it comes to adaptation to these extreme events. And the 3rd round is going to look at financing. And so we have 1 or 2 of our panelists for each one of these rounds. And then we'll have a final round with you as the audience, just to interact even more freely with our panelists. Now, at any time, we want you as an audience to feel free, use the chat box. I think there's a Q&A box. If not, just put your questions and comments in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that. And we'll just try and keep it as dynamic as possible. Our panelists have so much to share with us. And of course, you as audience also have insights, and your questions will just really enliven the discussion. So with that, I'd like to just turn our time to the panelists. And Mauricio, could I ask you, is there any particular order or any lineup that we have? Otherwise, panelists, be on standby. You're almost on.
No, I mean, we are flexible, so please.
Okay.
The panel is yours.
Well, all right. Well, super. Then I understand that what I'll do, if the panelists are ready, I will group Stuart and Tadashi together, and then Sophie and Dominique and Ekhosuehi will have you be the caboose. So if each one of you would just start out with your few minutes of statements, we'll just go through in that order: Stuart, Tadashi, then Sophie and Dominique and Ekhosuehi, and then we'll dive right into some questions with all of you. So with that, Stuart, could I hand over the mic to you?
Sure, thanks very much, Coco. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. Thumbs up would be great. Are we okay? Yes, nodding heads. Jeannie, give me a nod. Good to see some familiar faces and names. And I think Jeannie and I haven't seen each other, and I don't know, I might have still been at HUD, which is ages and ages ago. And of course, COVID has made everything feel very elongated and kind of in a time warp. So again, my name is Stuart Sarkozy-Bonasi. I'm with Resilient Cities Network. And a huge thanks to the organizers for such an amazing event and having us here with you. As most of you probably know, Resilient Cities Network is the global evolved organization that came out of the 100 Resilient Cities movement, or the program that was housed at Rockefeller Foundation. And now we are a separate nonprofit, a membership network that has all those same cities and the chief resilience officers in it. But we're different in the sense that we're still doing urban resilience, and our version of it being very holistic and equitable resilience. But now we're city-led and have a regionally driven and partnership-based way of working that's really impact focused, because now we have lots of strategies and lots of chief resilience officers, and the movement has grown even outside our network. And part of that is because when we say resilience, we mean, again, something very holistic that looks at not just surviving, which is relevant to the conversation today, not just adapting, also relevant, but thriving in the face of these growing combination of shocks and stresses. So for us, it's a much more holistic view at what we mean by even preparing for disasters, because we don't look at it as just survival and adaptation, or in the sense of climate change, just mitigation. It's all of it together. And I think for all of us, I referenced it, but we don't really need many more reminders. Thank you, world. But we've got everything from pandemic to racial injustice, climate threats, war, and the hits keep coming, and they come in combinations. And where we already have stresses, those shocks really disempower and disenfranchise and really change the makeup of the communities we're working in. So the way we work now is in three ways. Empowering our cities and our chief resilience officers, and that has kind of always been the case, and with and through partners, but now also mobilizing and implementing. And the mobilizing is especially where I sit, and I'll talk about that in a second, but the implementation is very different because now we have lots of strategies, lots of initiatives and projects. We have movement that has been created, and now we want to implement on the ground to really be able to do what we're saying we're doing. And that's key for this conversation today. And it's key for the work that I'm doing, because we're looking at tools, funding, finance, programs, and policies in ways that we could not do it when we were just doing strategies or placing chief resilience officers. And for me, that means working on the establishment, big announcement last week, of the Resilient Community Impact Fund with 2 seed funders, working on a resilient community development finance lending tool, the R-Lens that was developed with us and on other partners, but also, and this is also relevant, working with partners like the Z Zurich Foundation and Zurich, engaging with Bank of America and other partners to fund these kinds of projects and do things like our Urban Ocean project, while we're also looking at climate and the threats from these big natural disasters and shocks and stresses. So I'll stop there. That's a little bit about us and the work that we're doing and the work that I'm doing in particular. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So thanks very much.
Wonderful. You've already given us, well, at least I've written down several keywords. I'd love to circle back. Just as a spoiler, Ekhosuehi, I want to hear a conversation between you and Stuart. I heard some familiar insurance and risk transfer terms like Zurich and of course, those partners. So wonderful. We're going to bring you together.
You can
and
tell
also,
that I was looking directly at her when
you
I
can look exactly. It's the power. It's the power of networks, right? I know that many of us have had this privilege of working together. So thanks a lot, Stuart. Tedeschi, could I swing over to you? You've also, working with OECD, you've got a real bird's eye view of what's going on, particularly in industrialized countries. We're really eager to hear some opening words from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Coco. Can you hear me well? Yes, great, thank you. So again, thank you for the invitation. So I'm working in areas of public policy, basically. So I like to bring a few thoughts from that point of view. Particularly as an introduction today, I like to focus and test this idea, a systemic thinking or systemic approach to climate adaptation and financing, because financing is really linked with how you think, particularly about investment, and then that systemic thinking on the public investment is really creating opportunity to reduce the cost and the need for financing. So that's a kind of storyline that I'm thinking of. Like to start with a story which I am always using this when I'm talking about my country, Japan, on urban resilience. It's not really urban, but actually when, I don't know if you remember, I don't know, it's in 2019 when we had a big flood in Japan. And I was in France, and then it was so shocking to see that, brand new Shinkansen train, it's like, 10 trains, parked in a train, what is called train yard, was totally flooded by the water, and everybody was just seeing it unbelievably, because it's really a brand new train, and people know that, okay, Shinkansen is so famous for punctual and fast and nice comfortable train, but actually with just only one heavy rains, and like 10 of these are underwater. And I was just wondering what happened on this. And actually it's just a matter of poor planning in terms of putting this, planning this train yard into the low lying areas of a city. And this is just a sort of, anecdotal story, but it's important to think about considering disaster risk and resilience in investment decisions, particularly in a sense of in the current uncertainty, the exponential impact of the climate change. Actually, it's really difficult, of course, to prepare for different types of disaster, but I think there are some ways to think about this. Another story that I'm also struck is about the current supply chain issues. So, for example, I'm seeing, of course, the war in Ukraine is an extreme case, but a bit old case, but again, a bit of Japanese case. But when we had a Bangkok big flood in 2000, I think it was 11, many of the production site was also underwater, and a lot of economic activity has been on hold. Some problems which is also not related to climate particularly, but Suez Canal is blocked, and the supply chain is interrupted. So actually, this systemic thinking approach is very interesting, and also can be applied more widely when we talk about the disaster risk. So how, for example, how the food supply chain is affected by sort of short of water or excess water issues, or how land use restriction or land use regulation, to shifting away development from risk-prone areas, how can that land use policy can improve the well-being of urban citizens and bringing some other co-benefit for social aspect. So when you're thinking, different ways of systems thinking, it really creates a lot of justification for extra investment, and then also helping public and private sector to put aside some fund, for to prepare for the external, unexpected risks. So I stop here, and then my contribution can be also along these lines afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think your examples of a flooded train yard and the global supply chain issues, so salient. We really feel those today with the latest with the situation in Ukraine. They're thinking about the price of wheat in Egypt. One hears that very frequently in the news these days. And so we're really looking forward to that next conversation. Thank you so much, Tadashi. And Sophie, I know that you've also been thinking a lot about risks. And I'd love to just pull you in, another insurance friend, but now wearing additional hats. There's that risk through line. Sophie, really curious to hear what you have to tell us as a kickoff.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for the kind invitation. It's great to get to meet a bunch of really engaged people, I think from around the world, who are taking this so seriously. So thank you. And thank you, Mauricio, for the kind invitation to meet with you all today. So I guess my opening gambit, if I may be a little bit controversial, is to say that disasters aren't natural. So I'm going to dispute the premise of the question, if that's okay, and instead to say that a lot of what we do at the Centre for Disaster Protection is think about the fact that many disasters and their impact are their political choices, and their political choices that have financing woven through them, and cities are no different there. So by ways of introduction, at the Centre for Disaster Protection, we focus our multidisciplinary brains on the problems of addressing global crises with risk financing option solutions, evidence, as well as influencing. And much of my time goes on thinking about what are the solutions, what are the approaches, what are the frameworks or the partnerships that we need to have in place to generally move the entire system from paying for disasters after they happen to having plans and financing in place in advance of these climate shocks. And I think we have our anchor in climate shocks because I think, and maybe Ekhosuehi will speak to this, the analytics, the data, the evidence is accessible. But there are lots of read acrosses that we can do for other types of shocks, and Coco, your reflection there on things, the drivers of food insecurity is something that I think we could definitely get into. But to move the system to this kind of ex ante way of thinking, what does it actually mean in practice, and what does it mean for cities? I think is some interesting questions that we certainly pose ourselves. So I should say at the Centre we are an aid-funded organisation, so we work in low and middle income contexts. So we'll talk a lot, I think, today about financing options and strategies. And I think we just have to have a really broad view of what's in that toolkit, because what's on offer for Miami-Dade is not what's on offer for Mogadishu. And we just need to be really open and upfront about those conversations and do it in a very informed way. So for us, moving that system means having plans and money in place in advance of these shocks to protect lives and livelihoods. So Tadashi, to your point there about, kind of thinking through in what insurance languages is business interruption, but how do you keep the schools open? How do you make sure the fire department can respond? How do you keep the lights on? These are all really live questions. And those sorts of livelihood questions are also in scope, not just, what's the impact on maybe GDP at the time. So if we can frame disaster risk financing and risk financing, which is what we do, for us, that's paying with money and not with lives. So why do we have to have that kind of impact before everybody gets to the ready and in our context often creates humanitarian appeals. So we want smart, effective, quick money that's arranged in a predictable way so people can call on that money. They know it's coming. That's kind of the half of the equation. That's the money inside of the equation. And for us, that money needs to be linked to credible money out plans. So that's who owns the risk, on whose balance sheet does it sit, who's got the responsibility to respond, who is going to show up when these disasters strike. that I think is particularly interesting. I mean, it's to some extent a boring governance question, but as a pretend lawyer, I will tell you that's how the decisions get made, and that's why urban and city politics is some of the most interesting governance challenges that we all have to solve ourselves. And so it's having those plans to get it from, I don't know, let's say the mayor's budget to those people who are affected. We need to make sure that we have that agreed in advance of the shock happening. So I spend my day thinking about how we advise our clients, their governments, their international organizations, how do we finance resilience and use these kind of new financing approaches in the face of growing risk. So we're not city specialists. We deal with small island states. We'll deal with local government NGOs, local NGOs, local governments and civil society actors to really just use the tools that we have in this toolkit that I think Ekhosuehi will speak to as well, to quantify risk, to manage risk, to finance risk in different ways. I think just one point on cities, and then I'll hand over, is I think as small governments, cities are in an incredibly unique position because they can move very quickly. They are not, 15 ministries strong where you have to get everybody in a room to make some legislation, but they also have a very unique governance structure and very different power structures in every different context. But with that power structure, I think they've got such a direct accountability to their people. So it really does matter how decisions are made, and it really does matter to show up for your population in the event of these shocks. And because of urbanization, whatever those drivers are, many climate related, getting these kind of money in and money out plans in place, bringing together all of those experts in a room, getting the market in there, getting the risk financing people, getting the economists in there, getting the poverty specialists, whoever needs to be in that room. Cities can make that happen, and they can make it happen in a very dynamic way. And I look forward to figuring out how we might all do that collectively together. Thanks.
Boy, thank you, Sophie. I'm getting a very long wish list in my mind. I'll refrain for just a minute, but I think in the world of the climate negotiations, which is where I'm sitting right now, we would love to hear about all of your experiences and transfer those experiences to the many, many stakeholders, particularly countries, even though we're talking about urban areas here, which is a different level of governance. But it's gold. Thank you so much. Dominique, we're going to swing over to you. I'm really curious about your research and what insights you can bring to us from your research perspective. Please.
Thank you. It's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for the opportunity. For those that are not familiar with the Woodwell Climate Research Center, we recently changed our name from the Woods Hole Research Center to the Woodwell Climate Research Center. Partly as honoring our founder, George Woodwell, but also to make it a little bit more upfront of what our research goals are in terms of the climate change space. And so at the center, we focus a lot on understanding climate change and combating climate change, especially through nature-based solutions. We focus a lot on understanding deforestation in the tropics all the way to permafrost in the Arctic. And a lot of my work focuses on understanding physical climate risk. We work with several different partners, private institutions, municipalities, nonprofits. We've done work in the national security space. And a lot of what I think is applicable to this discussion is our work with those communities. There has recently been a lot of focus on for-profit providers of climate intelligence. There's been this surge in these organizations that sell this information so clients can have an advantage. And there's a lot of good research out there that isn't being put into the open source in a public domain that communities could really use. Methodologies aren't being published, data sources, model code, all these advances that would really help communities understand what adaptation projects, what resilience projects would be the best implemented is not available. And so what we've been trying to work towards is bring climate risk tools to many communities that don't necessarily have the resources
to hire climate scientists, consultants to do some of that work. And part of that is I think an important component is local engagement, because there is a strong sense of, okay, here's this great information, here you go, we'll walk away and run with it. But there has to be a form of bringing that local engagement, local knowledge of, okay, I can't just drop off a map and say, here's this risk information. There has to be a back and forth, a dialogue of what is most beneficial to a community, what projects are they trying to implement. So there is just this dialogue that has really brought forth in our engagements with communities that I think is really important to emphasize. And so I'm happy to speak more about the climate science aspect of this, understanding what scenarios to look at, uncertainties, local data, what we can, what we know and what we have to bring forth into our assessments before, not just thinking that, okay, whatever climate models are going to produce, this is the true output, but thinking that there is a range of possibilities and we need to account for those when we're looking at what adaptation projects to prioritize. And I'll stop there and hand it back over. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And of course, with the release about 2 or 3 weeks ago of IPCC's most recent volume on climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation, I think a lot of us are really thinking again or on a constant basis about what climate change means for real people living in real places and what you actually do about it. Really valuable. Thanks, Dominique. We're going to round off this first bit of introductions and come to you, Ekhosuehi. We've already heard a few strands of conversation, risk, where people live, risk to people's livelihoods. How do you prioritize? How do you think systematically so that you don't have a flooded train yard or a broken food supply chain? And Ekhosuehi, I know in many different iterations of your career, you've been thinking a lot about these issues. Over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Coco and Mauricio, obviously, for the invitation to be part of this and to just hear the other speakers. I think it's incredible, the information that's been shared already, which is extremely invaluable. So I guess from my perspective, for those who might be less aware, I work with the Insurance Development Forum, which is a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry, but co-chaired with the United Nations and the World Bank. But perhaps more importantly, it's really focused on how do we expand the use of insurance and related risk management capabilities, much of which has been touched on already in terms of risk analytics, data, etc., right through to the financing to help to support resilience when we think about the impacts of shocks, if it's weather-related events or otherwise. And that obviously is a very broad remit when you think about it, but the core of it is really about how do you deepen and improve kind of I characterize it as risk management capabilities across the board, across society. Because I think if there's one thing that we've learned from COVID experience, what we are witnessing in terms of the impacts of climate change is that we're not very good in terms of managing risk, in terms of taking information, generating it into information that you can act on and make decisions on. And so I do think that this is an area where as an institution and also just personally, there's a lot that can be done. To the theme of the discussion, which is obviously very much focused on urban environments, I was looking at some stats and I saw 1.5 billion people are added to global urban populations every week. I'm sure you guys have better stats than that on this, but that's something that I saw on the PwC report. And that obviously is a powerful force when you think about economic development and opportunities in terms of driving shared prosperity. But it also creates challenges when we think about the scale of infrastructure that is needed to cope with such population shifts, the kinds of services that people need, the environmental impact associated with that. What are we thinking as governments at the city level, institutional level, businesses in terms of protection for these individuals and for these businesses and ways of operating? And what are we thinking when we consider climate, as you said, Coco, right, which introduces an additional layer of complexity, right? Tadashi mentioned the issue of supply chains. So the fact that when you have these shocks, they are not localized to, Thailand, right? They have very real implications in Europe. They have very real implications in the US. Similarly, when you have shocks in Ukraine, you have very real implications for people in the Horn of Africa, right? Who are already dealing with those shocks. So from my perspective, when I think about the question, it's really about how can we as a community, in a very practical way, try to draw out on the skills and capabilities that exist within the industry, the insurance industries, risk management capabilities. And that's not to say that it is perfect, because there's a lot of scope for improvement in terms of how the industry thinks, models risks, and also the kinds of solutions that it actually develops to match the kinds of needs that we are seeing in society. And so a lot of my work and the focus of the IDF and our membership, which is diverse, is really trying to bring together various partners to focus on solutions, right? So I think that we have a fairly good idea theoretically. There's lots of examples of innovation occurring around the world. So the challenge is, how are we learning from those experiences? How are we scaling up things that work? How are we reforming perhaps systems that no longer serve us? And how are we driving innovation, right? How are we deepening the capacities of national governments to translate local data into information that they can feed into the decision-making process and make those difficult choices and trade-offs when you think about investments in adaptation? So for me, this is a question for cities. It's a question for rural areas. It's a question for sovereign governments. It's a question for businesses, right? And the topic could not be any more relevant. And so it's really exciting, obviously, to be part of this conversation. I'm really keen to hear from the other speakers, but perhaps also share some of the experiences that we've had in implementing some of these programs. If it's at the city level, at the sovereign level, what are some of the constraints and limitations around what the insurance industry can offer? And what are the limitations, again, when we think about the existing risk management capabilities around us and how that could be better leveraged? So thank you again, Coco, for all that you do, and Mauricio as well for the opportunity.
Well, thanks, Ekhosuehi, and to everybody for those initial comments. And now, as I promised, we're going to go into a series of rounds. So the first round, I wanted to ask Stuart and Tadashi in particular, but for all of you panelists, don't be shy, just jump in. And we may have one or two of those awkward moderation moments. Don't even worry about that, just jump in. Also the audience, if you want to raise a question or a comment, even if it's a little bit provocative, Sophie, I loved that you're pushing our boundaries a little bit. Please do that. So here's the first round. And this is especially for Stuart and Tadashi, but everybody's welcome. Let's talk about upper level governments. What responsibilities, because we have all these different levels of governance, what responsibilities, Stuart and Tadashi, do upper level governments have to help cities undertake actions, projects, practices that really tackle some of these risks that all of you have been talking about? What do upper level governments need to be doing to help cities? Interested in both of your thoughts.
Tadashi, do you want to take that first?
Okay, can I start then?
Sure, go ahead.
Luckily, I have a note on that, how national government can play a role. I have 3 items here. The very first one, actually, I also refer to the IPCC report talking about the adaptation governance, and particularly the view of the OECD is very much aligned with this thing, coordinated and then also defining roles and responsibility of different actors. And this is very important that national government can do, and national government are kind of, are responsible, I would say. I was looking for different national climate adaptation plans and found Australia one interesting because they have a specific section talking about adaptation roles and responsibilities. And it says that Australian government is responsible. First of all, this is really good that they recognize themselves as playing a leadership on adaptation issue. And then also, providing support or providing research and necessary solutions, and this is good. But also the plan mentions, the role of state and territory governments, and talking about local government as well. I mean, it's kind of obvious a bit, but it's quite important that it is recognized well and also documented in a certain place like national adaptation plans. Second role I was thinking is metropolitan coordination. This is a very particular role. So for example, if in the case of the city of Paris, in my city right now, has a great adaptation plan, but this plan is not always shared with the surrounding municipalities, right? So this is really important that they should coordinate. But actually, this metropolitan governance structure is not always, easily done by among municipalities. There needs some sort of, framework that to create this coordination, let's say, atmosphere, and national government can play a very important role. It's not only adaptation, but actually metropolitan governance is always not easy to be made only by local governments, right? So some leadership is necessary. And then I was thinking of the third issue, which is use of the national fund, of course. And when you do that at a national level, it's also quite important to take a place-based approach. So it's often a sector-based approach when you are talking about recovery fund or adaptation fund. But how the question is how government can again recognize this systemic link across sectors and the differentiated the impacts by places, and then try to use this national budget in a more efficient way by place. So this, I think there needs a lot of research and a bit of knowledge sharing on this third point. So I stop here.
Yeah, wonderful, thanks. And Stuart, I think you and Tadashi intersect with the work that you do on networks and cities. That middle point that you made, Tadashi, about metropolitan coordination. I'd love to hear more about that. How does it actually work? And I think, Sophie, you had also alluded to those governance issues and coordination. But Stuart, before I get the horse before the cart, what's your view? What do upper level or national governments need to do to facilitate cities undertaking, let's say, risk reduction or measures to deal with extreme events?
Yeah, I think Tadashi hit on a number of them, and ironically, that's how I met Tadashi years ago, working for the Department of Housing and Urban Development and coming to OECD all the time. And that coordination between national governments and the learning and sharing that then goes down a layer or two to the city level is the kind of work that we're doing now. And what Tadashi hit on that I would have said sort of in summary is that funding, policy, and programs end up being something that can help move cities and help them make decisions. Obviously, our intervention is the chief resilience officer who then breaks down silos within a city government. There's a similar pattern as you work up through municipal layers, through governance layers, right? And I think one of the ways that we get uncoordinated is that at national levels, there are ways that the silos are broken up that don't always match the silos at the local level. And this is the case even in very small locations. And I think it is a matter of context, because where there are huge national policy, programmatic, and funding levers, if you will, that can make a difference at the city level, whatever that country context might be. In my island resilience work, especially where it's smaller locations, there's a whole level of control that is more city-like, and it can run right down to the local level. So I think part of what is amazing with the network play is that a city in Africa can teach a city in Latin America and the Caribbean that can pass it on to one of our APAC cities, or in the North America context, and in the reverse. And so when we see national governments do good things, we share that and they share that. But what really happens is what then happens on the ground. And it was alluded to, right? Cities can move quickly. They also are directly tied to residents. And that's where sometimes they get themselves in a good place as well as in a bad place, because residents can react quickly to something that happened, and the mayor, or whatever form of government it is, the city manager, might have to immediately respond, whereas those federal levels are a little bit far away. And so what we try to do is push up to that federal level in the policy, programmatic, and funding standpoint, and say, what do cities have to do if they're the good solution providers, as opposed to just the bad challenge makers? Because that also happens, whether it's sanitation and plastics, whether it's whatever it might be, right? You can go down a long list of the things that go wrong at the city level that they can also fix. And so there has to be that coordination. And indeed, we used to talk about that at OECD and lots of these other sort of higher level conversations. How do those things kind of reflect on a continuum up and down? And that is a lot of our work, even though our primary contact is the Chief Resilience Officer sitting inside the city, trying to break those silos down.
Yeah. Oof. I want to have side conversations. We need 4 hours for all of this. But if I could just take advantage of my moderator role, Tadashi and Stuart, you both mentioned with slightly different words, the coordination opportunity or challenge. You also mentioned that, Sophie. Could I pull you in and just ask, for those of us who, like me, I don't know that much about urban governance, what's it actually look like? Could you tell me, so that I could tell my kids at dinner, how do cities coordinate with national governments or with each other? Does it look like a Chief Resilience Officer picking up the phone and calling somebody else, or do they have a platform and write each other messages? What's it actually look like? Like, what would the good practice be?
Yeah, so I think if we can, I mean, there's loads of answers to that. And I think the dumb answer is it depends. And it's not a dumb answer. It's like context is really important. If you use the lens of financing to answer that question, then I would say that because it's very context specific, there are limited good examples of how risk and money in the face of risk is well managed. So if you take I don't know, a North American US example of, as a mayor, it has to get to the point where it hurts so bad that you pick up the phone to maybe the governor, and then you really don't want to phone the White House. You don't want to alert the federal government, but it's got to hurt, right? You don't get credit for managing stuff really, really well. You don't get credit for being a really great steward of all your taxation revenue. You don't get credit for elevating or like managing your waste and sanitation really well, because a lot of what's happening at the city level is the stuff that you expect as a consumer of these services, right? You don't get cross with Joe Biden when your recycling isn't picked up, or you can't compost, but you're paying, my God, I'm paying my council tax, I'm paying, my property taxes. You're like, you're paying a bunch of taxes for the federal government as well. And, that accountability is blurred. And it's very similar in the European context, where there are, clear and obvious governance taxation regimes. And guess what? That gets even worse in low income contexts when that coordination is. So I think we've got our incentives wrong. I think that coordination is based on, and it's my fault too, right? Because all I do is go around talking about the language of risk and how bad it might get. And you should probably worry about it because it's going to get real bad real soon. And it's already quite bad. And so there's an element of trying to reframe it and using finance as an incentive for better coordination. So it's like, hey, if you help me get some risk financing for this kind of sunny day flooding that we know we're going to get, that disrupts a bunch of properties that if we don't adapt to over the long period of time, is going to really, really be a problem. Then I'm going to keep phoning you. I'm going to keep phoning you every day for money, and I'm going to keep phoning you for that. Then that could be a way to reframe some of it, to use finance as an incentive. Fundamentally, I think we need to get this, I mean, my gambit, I think, always to the Rockefeller folks was always the 100 Hussey guys. It's like, can we have a chief risk officer instead of a chief resilience officer? And actually, we do have chief risk officers, but they're not empowered to manage risk. They're empowered to manage financial risk, but are they really empowered to manage the risk of financing a flood or financing extreme heat? So I think there's a bit of reframing there as well that really puts the power in the hands of making risk transparent and opaque and making it somebody's job to worry about it. And that needs to be at the local level and at the national level too. So we're not so surprised when we have to, we shouldn't have been surprised with the pandemic. Everyone was screaming about it. Lots of people were screaming about it. Not everybody was screaming about it. And we should have had plans in place. And it was, we had the head of the UN, OCHA, saying, if it came as a surprise, we weren't looking. And, those sorts of things are really real. So coordination in practice, I think no one likes to be coordinated, but it has to happen. And if we can use finance as a lens to incentivize better action and preparedness to risk, then I think that then we've got some tools in the toolkit ready to go to help that coordination happen.
Oh, I love it. Sophie, you're our panel provocateur. I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Stuart,
I have to keep reminding myself it's being recorded though, right? So I keep
right. We'll keep it rated PG. Stuart and Tadashi, what from your perspectives does coordination look like between a national level and a city level? And again, everyone, this is through the lens of cities are often right on the front line of extreme events. They're often in systems. So what happens over here may have a huge impact on what happens in your city, even though it's physically removed, but it's in the same system. What does the coordination look like? And could, for example, any good practices that you could tell us about?
I mean, I was going to react quickly and say that one of the reasons that the chief resilience officer position, in a sense, we've seen grow in places outside our network is that they're doing a lot of what Sophie is saying, which is trying to, at all levels, trying to break down these kind of these barriers we've had, especially when we look at risk in a way, as she described, where like, oops, that happened. It was often so much in recovery, right? So part of that lens is a coordination that's much more has a pre-recovery mindset rather than this recovery mindset, because we're constantly in recovery and we tend to fund lots of risk and disaster reduction that's post-risk and disaster. And as Sophie said at the beginning, they don't have to be disasters. It's when they collide with other elements that are going on. And we've seen not just the local, but state. And we made a recommendation for a federal chief resilience officer, and you see climate and risk and resilience kind of coming together, especially around finance at multiple layers in all kinds of different places in the world. And I think that coordination aspect where transportation at the federal level and at the local level is talking to parks and sanitation and, over to Tadashi's comment about the trains. We saw that with Hurricane Sandy in the United States. I worked on the Hurricane Sandy task force as I left the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what happened to the rail lines is like what we're fearing happens with Ukraine as supplies stop, right? When rail lines are flooded. And he saw it with all of those trains in Japan, but that could be anywhere. And so part of this really is making sure that we sort of bust up the way we do planning at local levels that might be funded by federal, and the federal makes that happen. And bankers and lenders and others are also coordinated with that kind of cross silo breaking. It's not easy, and it's basically what we've all kind of been doing as we stare at each other right now, but it is what has to happen in order to make sure that dollar spent is a $4 or whatever euro return. or more in terms of co-benefits and benefits and kind of resilience dividends. So that breaking down has to happen at each of those layers. And I think, we see good versions of that as we've discussed, but there are also lots and lots of places where that does not happen.
Tadashi?
Sure. I just found this nice, photo of this train. So I just, if you don't mind, I just shared it in the chat. So on the coordination, I think, yes, Matt is very aligned with what I'm thinking, but maybe additional point is a target, perhaps. So, we as an OECD are working a lot on, strengthening subnational indicators and so on. Adaptation is an area that is, less advanced, I would say, particularly subnational. And we are looking at different, again, city level adaptation plans, and then also looking at national level adaptation plans, and then comparing the targets. Some cities are setting a, quantitative target, some are qualitative, but it's not so much, I don't find many cases where national and local government talk together about, what would be the common target for adaptation. Of course, as I said, the locality, the impacts are very different from place to place. But at least when we talk about coordination, it's very important that national and local government shares the concerns, and then also shares a sort of vision and targets of this particular locality about what to do. And then after that, you can talk about, what is the role of cities, what is the role of national government. So one thing, we could push forward is really to discuss what are the common interfaces or languages or indicators which can connect between national and local, and how we can, develop this together in a specific country context. I think that's one of the important tools. Yeah.
Wonderful. You've all inspired me, and I'm putting a little invitation or challenge to the audience in the chat box, which I'll put in just a second. In the interest of time, this is just really brilliant. Dominique, I'm going to pull you in and broaden out the discussion a little bit. And what I'm going to post now is a question to you. And Sophie, of course, this is actually your real question, even though I jumped line and pulled you in. But I'm really curious, how can cities, here's the question, how can cities identify and prioritize their needs when it comes to maybe hard investments, something built, but as well as those soft investments, soft infrastructure that could be health or education or contingency plans. You guys are the experts. But how can cities identify and prioritize those needs and then turn those into implementable projects? Any insights that you have, Dominique and Sophie? And then I'm also going to pull in one or two of the others like I did on the left.
Right, yeah, definitely. So I think I'm going to speak to it from the climate risk data perspective of assessments, community risk assessments, and what I think needs to happen in those assessments so that cities, municipalities can figure out what types of infrastructure, what type of projects to prioritize. And the first theme I think I want to discuss is kind of scenario analysis. And there's two different types. There's uncertainty, and this relates to different scenarios that we're projecting with climate models. But there's also uncertainty in terms of what climate models are telling us are going to happen in the future. As we go further out in time, we are less confident in what we think will happen. And so there's a range of possibilities that we need to account for when we're building infrastructure, and make sure that those pieces of those projects are flexible enough so that we don't have to rebuild it again. We can incrementally change it. So that kind of robustness, that flexibility is really important. And the second piece is multivariate. I think traditionally risks have been looked at in the sense of each risk is independent from the other, where fires, floods, heat, droughts, they're all analyzed independent from one another. But what I think is starting to happen more now is a little bit more of that multivariate analysis, where we look at how there's correlations between them, what types of how those correlations are changing over time, and what climate models are telling us those correlations are going to happen. And so that we're seeing different, shifts in certain weather patterns that are more persistent. They're going to cause more events to happen simultaneously. So one example, I think a good example is this is in flooding. We look at how storm surge and rainfall are. We usually map those out independently from one another, and this is pretty common in the U.S., where FEMA maps, they only look at how storm surge, they model storm surge, and then they model rainfall, and they put them two together at the end of the process. And in actuality, there's a lot of extra risk that isn't analyzed because those events are modeled as a compound event. And actually, I'd like to share something in the screen, if that's all right, with.
As long as you have I'm looking to our technical help just to make sure that Dominique has the whatever keys he needs.
It says host disabled participant sharing.
Could our IT wizards give Dominique the rights to share his screen for a bit? And in the meantime, while you're getting those rights, Dominique, I can really imagine an extreme heat event. I know that that you're thinking about that, Mauricio and others. What if we had an extreme heat event and a big monsoon and a storm surge all at once? How would a city deal with that? And who knows, maybe if there's a heat event, maybe it's also affecting food supply chains. So I find this really intriguing, and so many people affected in a really concentrated way. Dominique, do you have the rights yet?
I do. Here, I'm going to share this image.
Here we go. Okay.
Hopefully
Yep,
you
we
can
can
see
see it.
a map on the left and a graph on the right. All right, so this is part of a project we did with Chelsea, Massachusetts. Chelsea is located just north of Boston, just to give you some context geographically. And on the left, we're looking at the flood extent for the joint rainfall and storm surge 100-year event. And it's separated into 3 different time periods. You have the historic and the very light turquoise, 2050 in the slightly darker one, and then 2080 in the darkest color. If we were just looking at the amount of area that was flooded, storm surge would, the independent storm surge event would flood the greatest amount of area. But if we change the metric and look at the number of structures that are impacted, and that's what the graph on the right is looking at, is we see that rainfall and the joint event impact the greatest number of structures. So there has to be, when you're looking at how or what type of project to implement, you have to have a range of metrics, a range of scenarios, and not just focus on one type, so that down the line you will be blindsided by what might happen later on. And then finally, just a quick image on two different types of climate perils that are happening in quite quick succession of one another. And this is looking at Australia, where they had a very significant brush fire season a couple of years ago, and those are outlined in those red polygons. And just a couple of weeks ago, they had some very severe rainfall, record rainfall. And so many of these same areas that were affected by those fires are receiving huge amounts of rainfall. So this whiplash effect of events is another component of trying to understand which projects to implement that can handle these multiple events, so that you get the most bang for your buck. And because these projects are all expensive, it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, and so being able to accommodate these different events, multivariate uncertainty, is, I think, a really important part of the puzzle. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Boy, thanks, Stuart. Stuart. Thank you, Dominique. I think that you are really inspiring us because I just looked over at the chat box and it didn't quite explode, but we got 3 or 4 or 5 responses. So let's dig into that. And Sophie, because you were supposed to be in this round anyway, I'd love to pull you in. Dominique, you know what comes to mind when you're talking about multiple risks coinciding in a city or an urban environment? But it sounds like a hot mess. What do decision makers do to keep people safe, to keep cities and hospitals, education going, keeping the lights on, as you said, Sophie? How, when you're thinking about scenarios where investments should go and that flexibility, where to even start? It sounds so kind of challenging, even though the risks that you just painted, I don't know about all of you as an audience, but I could almost get like Hollywood scenes in my mind. But how is a decision maker at a city level supposed to deal with that complexity?
Is that me or Ekhosuehi? Who do you want?
Sophie, go ahead.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So this is a really common challenge that we certainly have, and I think it manifests at all levels of governments. But to take the city lens at the moment, hindsight bias, I think, is probably one of the biggest drivers of trying to manage risk. Oh, we had a flood last year, it was really bad, and we got loads of stick for it, and it meant all these things couldn't happen. So could you have a look at flood, please? And recency bias, I guess, is part of it. And also, I think as a policymaker, you care about the problems that might manifest in the next 5 years, if you're using that as your proxy for your election cycle. So I think some of those considerations are a real anathema to robust risk-informed decision-making. And that's a problem. So a lot of the time we are helping to shape the right question. So lots of clients will come, and I think, Dominic, you get it, and Ekhosuehi, I know you do, like, how can you help me manage this flood risk? And you're like, okay, cool. Yeah, we can figure out how much it's going to flood. We can figure out, to within beautiful levels of granularity, what it's going to impact. To your point, you can map a whole, ecosystem. That's not your biggest risk, right? And it might not be that you want to solve your biggest risk, but that might not be your biggest interruption. So, I mean, some of the cities in California is a great way of doing this. Like, the earthquake risk is so big, but so extreme that no one's even trying to solve, no one's paying for it, right? It's just like, it's there. The government have done something about it. Who knows if it's going to cover all the risk? There's some insurance, it's fine, problem solved. And yeah, to some extent you could put it in a box. So sorry, I'm not being very articulate. So there's recency bias, and you'll come and say, please, can we have some flood insurance, or can we manage flood? That might not be the biggest driver of risk. It might also not be the biggest risk that is likely to impact them or impact the most number of lives and livelihoods. It might be something like an extreme freeze. So there's a cyclical nature to climate events as well that you have to figure out. So I don't think it's worth going through the most expensive risks. It's not going through the most likely risks either. You have to take your client through all of the things that could impact them and talk about the trade-offs. So those trade-offs are then manifest in things like California with earthquake, where it's so big and so scary, we've popped it in a box and we've done the best we can to solve it. We're never going to be able to cover the full cost of a major earthquake in California. It's just too big, everything's too expensive, there's too much at stake. So what can we solve for? And I also think that's a decent approach for cities. Like, what can we actually fix? What is achievable, and what can we realistically finance? That might not be the huge tsunami. That's going to have to be on the government's balance sheet, because we cannot pay for that. What we can pay for is flooding of the metro system. What we can pay for is extreme rainfall over a certain period of time, or extreme heat. These things are manageable. And I think it comes back to your point about having that open dialogue. And I mean, Stuart, to your point about, how you can use those strategic resiliency officers to open that dialogue, to be like, listen, we cannot pay for an earthquake of this magnitude. It's going to be too big. It's going to overwhelm our local, the city government system. That is definition of a disaster. We're going to need different financing for that. But what we can pay for and what we are prepared to be responsible for and be on the hook for and demonstrate in our budgets are these sorts of things: sunny day flooding, extreme heat over a certain period of time. And there's really great, because of the 100 RC work and also other work, there's great examples of governments being really, local governments being really proactive about that and being really coordinated, certainly with heat. So I think it's a nuanced question. A lot of it is articulating the trade-offs of what can be managed, what should be managed, and whose job it is going to be to manage it. Rant over.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique and Sophie. Really, thanks a lot for that. Ekhosuehi, you're up next, but before we go over to the finance question, we're building up our expectations so big, but we're getting to you. Jeannie and also Rich, you posted some just some passing comments in the chat, and if you're willing, I'd love to pull you in. Rich, you tell us that you're working with the municipal government and that you actually have used multivariate analysis. And Jeannie, you mentioned using maps as that they're very visual. And from both of you, you're both in some ways pointing towards the engagement of maybe citizens or stakeholders in identifying these priorities. And that's what we're talking about here. How do cities with their budgets or other finance tools decide what do they do? They have a deeply uncertain future when it comes to climate change impacts. Dominique, you gave us some examples. They have a huge, remit that they have to do right now. Just keeping the trash collected is a really big, really big, heavy thing. But how do cities identify what to do and involve all the important stakeholders? Rich and Jeannie, I don't know if you want to hop in, because I know you,
I think Rich sent a message that he had to leave, but
okay.
Here he should speak up. Rich? No, okay. It's all about communication. Those maps are very dramatic. And so if I were an advocate, I would leak those to the newspaper and I would get that kind of information out so that this would become a topic of conversation, or it energized groups that would put pressure on the political leaders who have to make some sort of decisions about these sorts of things. So we will have a session tomorrow about communication, by the way, but there's the science, and then we have to get the credibility around the science, and then we have to be able to say it out in simple words so that people understand it. And as we've seen with COVID, it's not so easy sometimes. So to be smart and strategic about this is really important, because I wouldn't understand Dominique's scenarios and multivariate analysis, but I sure would look at that map and go, wow, where's my house here? And so I think that's what we have to do, add that layer.
I appreciate that a lot, Jeannie. We also had a question from Chrissy about transportation. That was several minutes ago, but for any of you on the panel, have you dealt with transportation? I know, Tadashi, in your example, you mentioned railways and needing to think about and kind of prioritize, but prioritize in a systems thinking approach. Any other reflections on transport, which is both a soft and a hard system and very vulnerable to interruption?
I can't comment on, I don't have any experience working on infrastructure, but there's some work that's been done by, I think, the Geneva Association. And this is, and also, I think, some colleagues in Tokyo Marine, that actually looked at, again, using the example from Tadashi in Japan and the Shinkansen. And when the government was really looking at how can they ensure that, right? And what elements of the Shinkansen system should they ensure as opposed to, manage in other ways. So I can probably after this meeting share that body of work in the event that it is useful in the context of the question.
Thanks a lot in advance, Ekhosuehi.
Tadashi's image that he shared with us is certainly dramatic enough. There were all those high-speed rails up to their windows.
10 meters, can you imagine?
I'm so shocked. So I remember these photos, and so I put it, share with. So, well, the question, I'm checking question, and yes, I take this question as an opportunity, I mean, to link really adaptation and mitigation as well. So actually, when we talk about, priorities and financing, it's really important that, what are the co-benefit that, by combining the two. The other thing is, we use the word critical infrastructure, right? So when we talk about energy systems, transport systems, again, I think that the prioritization should be really made towards infrastructure, including transport, which really has a sort of devastating impacts when it's interrupted. And linking with that, actually, it's also related to Jeannie's point of communication. I think one of the things that OECD is advocating is the concept of this cost of inaction. So saying the damage or estimating the damage as well. But if you say that the cost of inaction, this is, I think, a lot used in the air pollution field, I guess, and flood as well, but not every aspect of different adaptation impact. So maybe we can also use this into this communicating with people how much damage you will see by using this cost of inaction. So it's not too specific to transport, but that was my thought.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. And it's really sounding to me like, Jeannie, I'm going back to what you said about maps. It may be that certain tools or certain sectors leave a person cold just because may not be part of your remit, but understanding the spatial interactions, whether it's where's my house on that map, or ooh, actually, if the trains don't deliver, that means somehow that kind of information relayed to decision makers in an urban area or even in a national area. It sounds like those kinds of tools are really helpful in this question of what are the priorities, what needs to be done, which year, what needs to be hard, what needs to be flexible or soft. We in the international climate negotiations would love to get more information like that, even though we're talking about cities and subnational levels today. Okay, let me go on. The time is completely flying. So Ekhosuehi, here we are, round 3. And this is especially for you, but I don't want to leave you alone. So we'll pull in others. And actually, Jeannie, I just saw your hand. You must have a really pertinent question. Ekhosuehi, can I pause you just for a moment? Jeannie?
Sorry about that. I took it down because you were going to go to Ekhosuehi, but I see Marilyn Taylor is on the here, so maybe she just left. There she is. Oh, good. Who was an architect with SOM and very, very involved in critical infrastructure, particularly after 9/11 and in New York City and in other places. And the idea of communication and getting information to decision makers was part of her remit as she presented things. And I didn't know if she wanted to say something quickly about that, and then we'll get to Ekhosuehi. Sorry, Marilyn. You're on mute. You're on mute.
No, I'm not. Thank you. Jeannie, thanks so much. I was sorry I couldn't weigh in this morning as well, but thank you very much for asking me. I think it's absolutely critical in the United States and elsewhere to build the integration of the 3 levels of government and the private sector. But none of that really hits the mark unless we can build an understanding of the communities. And frankly, how many of you were born being able to read those maps and diagrams of water or water rise, or how long it was going to take and when it was going to look like, and why should we worry about 2200 when I got to take care of things today? So I do think, and I look forward to tomorrow and the communication discussion, because this is the time where we have to weigh in where the global, the regional, and the very hyper-local all are well understood, so each party can play its part. There's lots more to say, but that's essentially the heart of it.
We'll get you tomorrow.
Thanks.
And thank you. Actually, you've just, Marilyn, if I got your name right, you just did set it up really nicely for Ekhosuehi. I know Ekhosuehi, some of these, it's really technical and risk oriented, but in some ways what Marilyn just said about understanding, what's the risk, what's actually the disruption, what things that we care about are exposed, what's the vulnerability or susceptibility to disruption. That's your world. So Ekhosuehi, can we first ask you, and of course others would love to pull you in, what kind of financing arrangements exist to support efforts that help keep cities safe from disruption? We've got climate change. We're hearing more and more about it all the time. What kind of financing tools are you seeing? What looks promising?
Okay, thanks.
Are you asking me?
Thanks, Marilyn. So I'm gonna swing to Ekhosuehi, and absolutely after she hops in, would love additional comments.
Okay. No, I think it's a great question, and I'm not going to claim responsibility for having the solutions here, Coco, right? But I think that the conversation earlier is important, because I always like to make the distinction between, and it was a point that was raised, right? Making information available and people's ownership of information, right? How vested are they? How do they trust that information, right? Is also a question that we have to think about when we think about communication of risk, right? And so within the IDF, and this is also linked to the financing question, there's a question of, okay, where does that information come from? Can I trust it? How is it communicated? How does it feed into decision-making process? But how does that also influence finance and the flows of finance? Because there's also a question when we think about finance around transparency of risk, right? So from my institution and the experiences that we've had kind of thinking through this over the years, and which has informed, I think, some of the approaches that we now have, is we try to think about this issue in a number of, I would say, almost like pillars, which is the first pillar, we want to make information available because there are positive impacts from that, right? So there is a question in terms of what is the architecture to allow for that information to be accessible to people, right? And this is an important question. It's a question of access to information, not only for corporates, a question of access for citizens, right? And what is the architecture that we are building that will allow for that to happen in a systemic way? And Dominic touched on it, which is how invested are we in the development of open systems, open modeling frameworks, right? How invested are we, if you're talking at a city level, sovereign level, in terms of standards around interoperability that can allow us to capture local data, but also be able to exchange it across different platforms or whatever the case it is to generate appropriate information. So I think that is one bucket when we think about communication, is not the output, but how do you get to the output? So what is the architecture to allow for that? The second element is when you talk about generating trust and ownership, right? Where is that information coming from, right? Yes, you can have international actors that do lots of fantastic work, great, high-level data that's produced on some of these things. But there's also a lot of work that's done at a national level by academic institutions, national meteorological institutions, etc. And it's often not harnessed to paint a context-specific local view of what does that mean to me in my country, in my city, or whatever the case might be. And that is important for trust, right? And then there's a third element to that, which is if we are going to say that all of this is necessary, right? How do we finance that, right? In a systemic way. And this goes back to the question of what are the risk management capabilities that we are building at a national level that are owned by the people in those countries so that they can continue to do this going forward, building, yes, and drawing upon international expertise. So I think that this is actually, I just wanted to highlight that point in terms of thinking about risk, what it means from an architectural delivery perspective, what it means from governance, and what it means for being able to inform the decision-making. So again, to your question, Coco, when we get to what does financing look like? there are a variety of instruments. I mean, as I said, I'm not an expert in on the various tools that are out there. But what I can say is that in many of the contexts that I've been engaged in, the conversation around insurance or risk is an important one. And it's great to hear about the country risk officers and all of that, because that is part of, again, the development of a national architecture where there is someone who is responsible for this, right? And someone who can treat to the issues that you raise in terms of how are the risks being connected? What are we thinking in terms of climate? What are the trade-offs when we talk about adaptation, right? And so those conversations in those contexts where we have them with national governments around risk allow us to paint a picture of why does this matter? So for example, in a project that we are working on in Peru, the government's interest was, we had a flood in 2018 because of El Nino, destroyed lots of critical assets, schools, etc. We want to put an insurance in place to cover 50,000 public schools. It was important for us to do that technical work because it was not just simply about disruption to infrastructure. It was the fact that as a result of disruption to infrastructure, children would be out of school for a significant amount of period. And there is a development cost to this, right? So it's not just, it's lives, it's livelihoods, but it's lost development, right? How do you translate that to a government so that they can begin to wrap their heads around what is it costing me, right? Or the fact that maybe what they're paying for it is actually not enough to cover, right? The real risks that sit on the book. And then this allows us to have further conversations around, so what are our priorities? And as Sophie mentioned, there are difficult trade-offs that will need to be made in terms of investments, right? What am I prepared to do, right? As a priority, what are some of the investments that I can make that I know, it's net positive, right? Those ones are on the margins. What are those, right? And this also takes us to a conversation around cultural acceptance at a national level of what that compromise will be. And it's a political question, right, for the directorate. And so for me, when I think about financing instruments, there's a stream that we have to go through. And for many of the countries that I am engaged with, and it's developing countries, the systems need to be strengthened, right? To be able to have those conversations in even more robust ways, right? Because those conversations are what will drive greater, I think, ability to negotiate in terms of the financing options available to them. They're also going to be the channel through which we innovate. And I always say to people, some of the innovations that we've seen around insurance and the use of parametric insurance have come from this process of trying to really understand the context, the limitations in terms of access to financing instruments and innovate beyond that. And I think that this is what climate change challenges us on many fronts to contend with, right? And unfortunately, it adds complexity because it also forces, I would say, the insurance industry to reflect on the tools that it has available, how it thinks about risk, how it models risk, to the point that Dominic was making in terms of not just simply relying on historical information. What do we see in terms of the tremendous uncertainty going forward if we are not reducing CO2 levels, right? So that's kind of my reflection on that, Coco. There are a number of instruments. I think governments should focus on, yes, this question. And a point that I want to highlight is you don't have to have perfect information to act, right? The information oftentimes is there, right? But it's harvesting that and building your own systems to be able to do that in a sustainable way going forward, because you require them for developing new solutions, if it is at a sub-sovereign level, but also at a sovereign level. So I'll pause here, Coco. Hopefully that was helpful.
It was really helpful. And I was nodding and I was looking at those of you who do have your camera on, and I saw a lot of resonance there, Ekhosuehi. Did I mention that we need 6 more hours to dive into all of this? But for you as an audience, we are drawing to the end of our time together. So maybe just in the last few minutes, we have maybe 6 minutes. I'm just looking at Jeannie and Mauricio, you're our fearless leaders. But I'd like to draw in the panel again. And of course, audience, this is for you, so we welcome you. But I'd like to draw on our panelists and ask if you had one recommendation for either a national level decision maker or a city level decision maker about extreme events and climate change, getting prepared, making an investment, what advice would you give? And we can go in reverse order. We can start with you, Ekhosuehi, and then Sophie and Dominique, and Tedeschi and Stewart.
Thanks, Coco, for putting me on the spot. I was hoping that others would go before me. Okay, I've talked so much about risk, right? I think that there is a tremendous amount of work that we need to do in terms of risk literacy. I don't know if that's an appropriate way to characterize it. And I don't say this lightly, because I actually fundamentally believe that it is an important lesson that we have to take away from the pandemic experience, and also climate change, and what we need to do. So we need to become better risk managers, right? And I think that what we have seen is that, people are concerned. There is an opportunity here where people are, there is a heightened awareness of, we need to do better, right? And I think that it is actually an opportunity to find ways to better communicate risk, to build our own national capabilities. There are lots of, I'm excited by the fact that there are lots of innovation and technology, technological tools out there that can help us to do some really remarkable things. So I'd encourage alliances that can help to drive that at a national level, at a city level. And for me, that's the foundation when you think about resilience and, helping to make difficult decisions less difficult.
Great, yes, thank you. Passing the baton to you, Sophie.
So quite similar. So I think mine is that it needs to be somebody's job to manage this risk. And I think, Stuart, we touched on the fact that it is in some places, but how do we do that everywhere? And because it's their job to manage the risk, they should also be empowered with looking at how to pay for those risks. So if we can get the risks on a balance sheet, and we can do the brutal process of you show me yours and I'll show you mine between local and national, or cities and national, then we might drive some change on how these risks should be better managed and financed. Because I have a lot of faith in the financing options being flexible, tailorable, available, certainly for high and middle income countries.
Wonderful, thank you. Dominique?
Well, on the theme of managing risk, I think I like to highlight the word redundancy. I think one of the best ways of managing risk is redundancy. And a lot of, I think what I've seen in adaptation projects is building something bigger, a bigger pipe, a higher storm wall, flood wall, and there hasn't been enough emphasis on redundancy in systems, which can lead to cascading resiliency down the line. So redundancy, I think, is the one word I'd like to focus on.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. And another whole set of conversations that we don't get the chance today just because the time is limited. But Dominique, if you have a chance, I think Stuart resonated earlier with some of the things that you were saying about the realizing the risks interact and making investments in a way that does build that interacting resilience as well. So maybe you guys can have a virtual coffee sometime. Thank you so much. What about you, Tedeschi? If you had advice, what advice would you give?
Thanks, Coco. So I reiterate the importance of the systemic thinking. So this needs a bit of transformative approach on different things. So keep saying that. Coordination across levels of government. And here, we have a program to invite national government to participate in this, how to improve the coordination. So we really like to promote this. And if, you could also find people who can be interested, please let me know. Then the final point, I wasn't able to say this before, but subnational government is really an investment, major investment actors. And we are launching a new report on how much of their public investment is going to climate issues. And it's really important to see these numbers, just not saying that subnational government, we are doing it, but showing this with numbers, like how much money is really spent, from the public budget is quite important. So we are trying to do, support cities with that aspect.
That's wonderful. And I know, at least again, from this meta level of international climate negotiations, I think there will be great interest in the report that you just mentioned. So I hope that OECD will have a chance to share that, because right now, of course, the accountants are trying to figure out how close to the 100 billion mark or more are countries in investing in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Thank you so much. And Stuart, coming back to you, if you were going to give some advice, what would it be to help cities, the place where now more than half of the world's population live, to keep people safer from some of these increasing impacts from climate change and other hazards?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and it's a massive question. I think I'll use both sides of my brain on this one. On the one hand, I would say don't be afraid to start with project level resilience building, meaning small lenders, small developers, and don't be afraid to start there. It seems, especially using tools like the kind that we've been trying to test and develop with in the United States with community development financial institutions who are doing lending. It's been an amazing process to see that. So that's a kind of really practical, it's lender-based, it's developer-based, it's tools, and it's the financing side. Because I'm a professional photographer, I cannot help but think that our storytelling has to be better. It has to be more graphic. It has to be understood through data. It might even be figuring out better ways to use the data and technology that drives towards storytelling that is more visual. So those are the two I'll pick. There's many, many more, but for me, they're very different ideas as well. And like I said, out of two sides of my brain, but that's the advice I would give in addition to everything else that's been said.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. What a tremendous panel you've been. And also thanks to the audience. I hope that we've managed to weave in your questions and your comments. We have used up the time. It's gone. So I'm going to pass the baton back to you, Jeannie and Mauricio. Mauricio, I actually saw that you had your hand up just a minute ago, and you're the organizer, so you have the last word anyway. Thanks so much, everyone. I hope that we can get your expertise and crowd it into the international climate negotiations, in addition to all of your other important work and your day jobs. Mauricio and Jeannie, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Coco, for that great moderation, and to all the panelists for those very insightful comments. I think it has been a great discussion. It is obvious that because of increasingly severe natural disasters due to climate change, local authorities, mayors, need to be much more conscious about the need to undertake adaptation-related projects and build resilience. That's not always easy. Certainly, there's a lot of challenges, not only on the operational side, but also in the financing one. But having received very interesting and innovative ideas from people like you definitely helps the cause. So thank you so much for that. Jeannie?
This has been an extraordinary conversation, and Coco is right. This could go on for at least 6 hours more, and I'm sorry we don't have 6 hours more. But one of our intentions in this is to reconvene in a year, perhaps in person, which would be very nice, so that we can see what progress we've made and what kind of new information, what innovations are occurring in this area. So we invite you in advance to something next year, and we thank you today for everything that you have done to enhance our thinking about what we need to do as we define urban adaptation and the solutions towards it. And we wish you well with all the work that you're doing in this area. So thank you. We are now going to take a little break of 15 minutes, 14 minutes, I guess. And then we will come back and discuss urban adaptation and extreme temperatures. So we'll go a little more deeply into extreme temperatures in the next session. So again, thank you. Come back in 15 minutes. We will welcome you then.